Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Theory of Change workshop. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Before we get started with our presentation, I just have a few housekeeping points to run through. Firstly, you're all automatically muted and your videos are turned off. Any questions you have, please do submit them throughout the session, but please make sure that they're in the Q&A function at the bottom there, because if you submit via chat, we won't be able to see them, and so we won't be able to answer your questions. I encourage you to answer your questions at any point, but we will also have the opportunity for questions at the end of our presentation, and we'll try to get through as many as possible in the allocated time, but if we don't, please do send us an email afterwards. Just to let you know that we're recording the session and we'll distribute the recording and presentation slides to attendees afterwards. And we'd also love your feedback from the session. So please do keep an eye open for a post-event survey in your inboxes over the coming days. So let's get started. My name is Dr. Helen Lawson and I'm Taso's Research Programs Manager. And this is...
Hi everyone, my name's Chappell and I'm a research officer at Taso.
So you'll be hearing from both of us throughout this session. Okay, I'd like to just very briefly introduce Taso for those of you that don't know. We're an independent hub for education professionals set up to support the sector and provide research, toolkits and evaluation guidance to help widen participation and improve equality within the sector. Taso was established by a consortium and incubated within King's College London, but we recently spun out from King's, so we're now an independent charity, which is very exciting. We're an affiliate What Works Centre and part of the UK government's What Works movement, and as you can see at the bottom of the slide there, we're funded by the OFS. We conduct research and support others in conducting research with the aim of eliminating equality gaps that exist in HE, and we want to enhance lives through evidence-based practice using research and evidence to improve current policies and practices within the higher education sector. This session is marked as introductory. We'll briefly look at what a theory of change is, consider the importance of having one for your project, and then we'll go through the process of how to develop a sound theory of change, and this will loosely be based on the theory of change for our summer schools project. So, the evaluation cycle. We are often asked when you should evaluate. Although evaluation is generally more effective when it's built in from the beginning, otherwise there's sometimes a risk that the data collected is not completely appropriate for the objectives which are set. Evaluation can also be retroactively applied to existing or completed initiatives. An effective evaluation is not an event that occurs at the end of an initiative, but a process that's ongoing. At Taso, we consider evaluation to be reiterative. As the circular design indicates, this is an iterative process that supports continuous improvement. The findings of your evaluation in measure should feed into the refinement of your theory of change, research questions, and research methods in reflect. This way, findings become more robust, and ideally, over time, you can generalize your findings to the wider program impact. Today, in this webinar, our focus is on the diagnose stage. This stage is the first step in designing your program or project evaluation and involves mapping the components of your intervention or project and describing how you will achieve the anticipated outcomes. This is known as a theory of change. Sarah.
Oh, thanks, Helen. So to start with, obviously, as Helen pointed out, this is an introductory session. So we're assuming that those attending haven't used a theory of change before or might not know quite what it is. So just to start with the basics then. So what is a theory of change? So it's an illustration or an outline of how and why a desired change happens. So in a particular setting. So here it could be in the HE setting, widening participation setting. So it's often looked as the missing middle. So between what your program does on one side, I've realized I'm in a mirror image, so I'm going to start with that side. So what your program does on one side and how it then leads to your desired goals on the other side. So let's imagine A is our program. So it could be a summer school, and that's what the example we'll be using today. Leads to the goal B. So simply put, it might be that you are looking to increase participation for underrepresented groups in higher education. So we're looking at mapping that bit in the middle between A and B. So what's happening there? What's helping A become B? What's the causal link there? And what can a theory of change help you do? So it can help you answer these questions. So first of all, is the intervention that you've chosen, your program for your activities, is it the right one to use? So a theory of change here will be really useful because you actually map your outcomes first. So you map what goals you want to achieve first, and then you can work backwards and see, is that activity that you've chosen going to help you achieve those goals? So you can be really transparent there and say, okay, well, if that activity is not going to help me achieve the goals that I want, I can make some tweaks there. And question number 2 there is your intervention achievable? So also part of a theory of change, which we'll see, is looking at your inputs, so looking at your resources. So do you have the resources available to actually achieve or actually carry out the intervention and then actually achieve the outcomes that you want? So you can look at that really closely to see if it's actually going to be achievable within the resources, within your budget, things like that. And then number 3, is your intervention testable? So as Helen pointed out in the outline of our session today, we're going to be looking at indicators of success, so actually measuring your intervention. So it's important within your theory of change to outline sources of evidence. So what areas of evidence and data can you look at to test whether your intervention is working, whether your activity is indeed working? So that's a little example of what a theory of change can help you do. But as I said, in this workshop, we're going to be going through an example of using a theory of change, so it will become a bit clearer then. So don't worry if you're still a little bit confused as to how you would use a theory of change. So developing a theory of change. So I'm going to move on to the actual template which Taso are using and which you will have seen. Hopefully you will have received an email with a pre-read pack. So you will have already received the theory of change template. So hopefully it means that it's familiar to you. But just a little caveat, there are so many different theory of change examples. You might already have one within your provider, within your company, wherever you are today. You'll be able to see that they look different in different scenarios, but they essentially all mapping out the same thing for different settings. So this is the template that we're going to be using today. So as you can see, there's little numbers. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the top left of each little box, there's numbers. So this is actually the order that you would fill in your theory of change, and that's the order that we'll be working through today. So if we start here with the situation, that's the actual setting that you're working in. So what's the current context? What's the problem that you're trying to resolve through your theory of change? So through your activity, what problem are you trying to address? And then that relates then to the aim. So what's the aim of your program? What's the aim of your outreach program? It could be quite broad, but it could equally be really specific. And then we move on to 3 and 4, which is our impact. So you'd look at long-term goals and as well as short and medium-term outcomes. So you're looking at both short-term and long-term before moving on to your actual activities. So what interventions are you doing? What is your program made up of? And then your direct deliverables from these activities. So what are the results? What are the outputs? You then move on to your inputs, which is what we discussed in the last slide. So looking at your resources. So what do you need in place in order to achieve your goals or achieve your activities? And then finally, you're looking at the assumptions. So these are things that are necessary for the success of your program. And also your rationale, which looks at the justification, so existing research on this area. So this is what we're going to be working through today. And I'm now going to pass you back to Helen, who's going to go through a working example with this theory of change template.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. As we said at the start, we're running through how to develop the theory of change using a summer school project as our example. Hopefully most of you will have received your template theory of change, but for those of you that haven't, we're very happy to circulate our template as part of the when we send the slides, when we send the presentation, and it's also available on our website. So first, we consider the situation or the problem that we want to address. In this instance, it's one that we're all very familiar with from working in this sector. Students from disadvantaged and underrepresented backgrounds are less likely to apply to and enroll in HE than their peers. So that's the situation, that's the problem that we're wanting our program, our project to address. Our aim, therefore, is to increase access and participation in HE for disadvantaged and underrepresented students. So if we move to the next slide, this is what our theory of change model starts to look like with our first two elements completed. We now start the process of backwards mapping until we have a framework that tells the story of our project and clearly shows a pathway for change. So as you can tell from the numbers, as Sarah's just indicated, your instinct, you might think, you would develop this framework from left to right, but we actually go backwards. So as we're working backwards, you can test all the links and assumptions that we're making throughout the theory development. You can test whether each of these hold true. Because this type of work can be challenging and can involve several moving parts, it's quite likely your framework will go through a number of revisions until a theory of change has emerged that is agreed upon. This discussion and debate, which might arise through the process, is a really valuable part of the process because it encourages you to think about and clearly articulate the underlying logic of your project or program. Sorry, just moving my notes down. Developing your theory collectively and involving a variety of stakeholders will also draw on the experience of those who will work on the project and its implementation. So the next stage is to think about the impacts and the outcomes, what we call the preconditions that our project needs to have in place in order to achieve our aims and address the problem or situation we've defined. So what needs to happen in order for more students from underrepresented groups to access and participate in HE? Well, one of the things that needs to happen is that they successfully enroll in HE. So that becomes one of the desired impacts of our project. For this to happen, it's necessary for students to actually want to go to higher education, excuse me. So this becomes one of our outcomes, that students see HE as a desirable option. So if we move to our next slide, we can now begin to see how we're starting to develop and complete our theory of change. We're thinking about our impact and our outcomes together, so that we're doing that movement of going backwards and forwards to make sure that those links that we're making, so for example, that students have increased knowledge of a subject option, that we test that and think, well, if they do have increased knowledge, then they're more likely for example, to progress to a subject specific, to specific subjects in HE, if, for example, the summer school that you've been holding is in itself subject specific. So moving on to slide 14, but before moving on to adding the outputs to our theory of change, we thought it would be helpful to have a look at the differences between an outcome and an output. When developing theories of change, the two are sometimes used interchangeably, even though they're significantly different. To get the context right, let's start with a simple non-HE related example.
Thanks, Helen. So yeah, we thought this was a good idea to put in just because, as Helen said, it's hard sometimes to think about what an output is and what an outcome is, and if they are the same thing. And as Helen said, they aren't. So I'm going to use this example of my niece. She's not fictional. She does exist, I can assure you. And it's her birthday. And more than anything in the world, she wants a unicorn themed cake for her birthday. So she's obsessed with unicorns. And she says, Auntie Sarah, please can I have a unicorn cake? I don't know why I'm responsible for her cake. It should be her mum. But anyway, that's by the by. So we say, okay, yep, we'll get this unicorn cake for you. But it's well past my capabilities of baking and decorating. So I'm not comfortable with making the cake myself. So instead, I'm going to research some different bakeries, and I'm going to make sure a bakery can actually produce this cake for my niece. So a lovely unicorn themed cake. And then I'm going to actually pay for this cake to ensure that we get the cake. So if I pause here for a moment, and if I wish I could ask you all what the outcome would be here, a lot of people would say the cake, but that's actually incorrect. So it's actually the output that which the cake is, and the outcome is in fact my happy niece. So the output is something which is a direct deliverable from the activity. It's something that's tangible, which is the cake. But let's imagine that the bakery got the cake completely wrong and they delivered a dinosaur themed cake. So my niece hates dinosaurs. She's actually pretty terrified of them. So if that was the case, we wouldn't have this outcome of my happy niece. We'd have an outcome of my, scared and upset niece because it's ruined her birthday. So the output here, it's really got to be the deliverable. So the thing that you know is going to happen. And then the outcome here is what you hope will happen as a result. So let's extend this analogy a little bit further. And let's imagine then that my niece really enjoys that unicorn cake so much that she decides she wants to have a go at baking herself. So it's her mum's birthday coming up in a couple of months, and she says that she would really like to bake her mum's birthday cake. So my niece is 7 years old. Well, she's just turned 8. So her baking skills and her decorating skills are, average at best, but she really wants to do this cake for her mum. So we have a little go at researching what cake she could do, looking at ingredients, looking at the equipment we might need. And my niece, bless her, decides she wants to do a Little Mermaid cake, which is very ambitious, but I'll let her go with that one. She really wants to do a Little Mermaid cake for her mum. So we go about baking, we go about decorating. And this is the result. So as we can see, I'd love to say her cake was on the left, but it most certainly isn't. So yeah, as we can see, she's missed the goal a little bit there. So we haven't quite got a result which is looking exactly how we wanted. But actually, it hasn't mattered in this occasion. So this unfortunate looking cake doesn't actually matter too much here, because we've actually changed what our outputs and our outcomes are. So here, rather than our cake being our output was actually that my niece was able to learn how to make a cake, have the opportunity to learn how to make a cake. So again, it's something really tangible. It's something that you know exists. She's had that opportunity. Whether she's successfully learned to, clearly she hasn't by the cake, but she has definitely had the opportunity to learn how to make a cake. So that output has been achieved. And then the outcome here is that we've got an increased knowledge. So my niece has increased knowledge of how to make that cake. So it doesn't matter too much that the cake doesn't look good or even taste good, because that's not the output. The output here was that she had the opportunity, and as a result, her knowledge was increased. So my niece decides to keep on practicing and to try again with some other characters, some of her other favorite characters. So we've got SpongeBob here. That every time the eye just terrifies me. But yeah, she's not getting much better, unfortunately, but she's still trying, bless her. And she's trying some more. And arguably she is getting better here. It's still very, very creepy, but she's going forward with that process. So she's keeping on trying and baking that cake. And then eventually we get to my sister's birthday, her mum's birthday. And our long-term impact is actually realized because she is able to bake a cake that not only looks good, but also tastes good. So that impact, that long-term goal, was actually realized by the process of learning how to bake that cake and increasing her knowledge. So what I'm trying to show here is that your outputs and your outcomes need to be really explicitly stated in your theory of change. And also that you might have unexpected outcomes sometimes, but they will ultimately lead to the impact, or you hope the impact that you want. So it's really important to be specific and also monitor unexpected outcomes, which might help achieve your impact. So if we go back to a theory of change, we're going to look at activities and outputs. So activities, as we mentioned before, are your actual activities, so say within your summer school, and your outputs are your deliverables. So these things that you know without a doubt will happen. So I know if I pay for a cake, that I will get my cake. So the cake here is the deliverable. So I'm going to hand back to Helen now, and she'll sort of realign this back with our summer school analogy, just in case you're very confused and probably just hungry thinking about cake, because I certainly am now.
Yes, we hope you've enjoyed our foray into cake making as much as we enjoyed looking at pictures of unfortunate cakes. But yeah, the point is really, because as we've said, it's very, very easy to confuse the output and the outcome. So just to bring us back to our summer school, to give you an example, we can't assume as an output that students will have developed increased knowledge of, for example, studying physics at HE through the activity attending a physics taster session. We can't state that. We have no control over how they were engaging with that session. They might not have been listening to the session. They could have been thinking about something else entirely. They could have been on their phone. But they could have just not really actually wanted to be there. The project has no control over whether and how the students engaged with this session. But what we can say is that by sitting in a lecture hall where the session is being held, students have been exposed to a subject taster. Now, in current context, the situation becomes a little bit more complex when you're working in a virtual environment. It's very, very hard to claim exposure to an event as an output, because this is very difficult to evidence and to control in an online context. But what we can say for sure is that the session went ahead, well, hopefully the session went ahead and students had the opportunity to attend. So this is the difference is the outputs are those that you, as the project manager, you have control over. The outcomes you don't have any control over. These are what you hope and what you assume will happen. So it's making those links again. You're making that assumption, and then later on we'll look at how you need to be able to justify the links that you're making between your activity, your output, and your outcome. So the outputs that follow project activities need to be things we know without question will happen. You'll see from our summer school example that the statements that follow our activities start with things like exposure to, interact with, experience of, opportunity to, because these are within the project's control. So we can now add our activities and outputs to our summer school theory of change. And as you can see, it's starting to flow through from one side to the other. So we go through that process of backwards mapping, and hopefully the story and the theory is starting to flow now from left to right. Subject taster sessions are held. Students are exposed to different subjects available at HE. Students have increased knowledge of subject options. Students progress to one of the subjects on offer at your summer school. Sarah.
Thank you. Just a reminder at this point as well, I know that people are talking in the chat as well, but if you do have any questions, or if there's something you're not clear on at any point, then just pop a question in the Q&A, and then we'll be monitoring that, so we can always interject and ask those questions at that point rather than at the end. Okay, so moving on to our inputs. So we talked about this right at the start of the session. So what sort of resources do you need? What activities, what resources do you need in place so that your activities can actually happen? So these can be tangible things. So things like staff. So you're going to have your outreach staff. You might also rope in sounds terrible, not rope in, but use student ambassadors, because that's what they're there for. You also need to think about your venue and your budget. So do you have the money needed to put on this activity? You need to be really realistic here, whether it's actually achievable. And then you can have intangible things. So you need buy-in. So for a university or higher education provider to run an outreach program, you need buy-in not only from the students, but also their parents and carers, their families, also the school. So a lot of your work, I know, will be through schools. So you need that buy-in from the school as well. A subject knowledge you might need. So you might, for them to come on to your outreach activities, they might need to have studied a certain subject, for example, or to have got grades in a certain subject. So you might need some subject knowledge. And you need your university or your outreach team's reputation to actually exist. You need to know that people know about you, or else why else are they going to apply to your outreach activities if they don't know that they're happening? And then things finally are operational. So operational inputs. So time is a massive thing here, because you need the time not only to plan your activities, but also to deliver your activities. You might also need promotional materials. You might need to advertise via social media. So you've got to think about that as well in your operational inputs. So if I move on here, we can see that I've added some inputs which are really specific to summer schools. So as I said, you need your outreach your outreach team's time, or your student success team's time. But also your student ambassadors, if they're going to be doing Q&A sessions or running subject tasters, things like that. I've looked at venue, so it's quite common for a summer school, as you well know, to have a residential element. So you will have, sorry, I've just seen a question pop up, which I'll answer in a second. So you'll have accommodation that you need for your students to be able to stay over, but also rooms around campus so that they can actually explore different rooms, so lecture theatres, as well as smaller seminar rooms, things like that. And as Helen actually discussed during the pandemic, so this is really relevant to Taso's work, because we're doing a summer school evaluation at the moment, and it is on online summer schools, so virtual summer schools. So it's been really important for our providers that are participating in this, that they've got an online platform that they know how to use, that they can set up a summer school on. And for some, it's the first time they've ever done it online. So this has been quite a challenging input for them to think about. And then also promotion materials. So again, advertising through social media, advertising through schools, and then data collection systems. So I know a lot of universities or higher education providers will use HEAT or an aim higher tracker, or they'll have their own internal databases which they use to input students when they apply, and then also track them throughout the summer school and after as well. And then also reputation, which we talked about in terms of people knowing about the university and about the events that are happening. So I'm just going to interject here, because Cherry's just asked a question about the distinction between tangible and operational inputs, which is quite a good question, because I mean, they look like they overlap, certainly. So I think tangible, yeah, it's just things like staff, budget, venue, so things that you actually have in your hand, whereas I guess time in that sense isn't as tangible in that sense. So that's why it's more of an operational thing. It's as well as, but you could argue obviously that promotion materials are tangible. So I'm not going to get too hung up in that, because I think it's important just for you to know what your inputs are, basically. So don't worry too much. You don't need to label them in your theory of change as tangible or intangible or operational. It's more just to think about different areas that you're looking at to know your resources. So you might have people that are higher up in your higher education provider who operationally have control over what you can deliver, as well as your own sort of department budget, staff and time as well. So it's just trying to think about all the different areas. I've also saw another question, but I think that will be a really good one to answer at the end, actually. So I'll leave that one till the end, okay? But just to let you know that I have seen that question. Okay, so that is our inputs. And we can see when we add them to our theory of change is almost complete now for summer schools. So I'm just going to pass you back over to Helen now, because she's going to go through the final part of the theory of change, which is looking at the rationale and assumptions behind your theory of change.
Okay, so in the case of our summer school project, our rationale is based on the research evidence that exists. So again, with your theory of change, it's really, really important to have your rationale, have a really, really sound rationale. And it's often based in research and evidence that's already in existence. So for example, with our summer school project that Sarah just mentioned, recent analysis conducted by Taso in collaboration with the Higher Education Access Tracker, HEAT, suggests that participation in summer schools is associated with a higher GCSE grades and HE progression, and these results also align with existing studies showing that students who attend a summer school express higher confidence and aspiration at the end than at the beginning. So with our theory of change for the summer school project, that's what we're wanting to test. It's extremely important to critically think through the assumptions on which your theory of change is based. Any interventional program is only as sound as its assumptions. Assumptions are too often implicit, which can lead to confusion and misunderstandings in the operation and evaluation of the initiative. So key here, again, is to look at your pathway for change. Look at the connections you're making between your impacts and your outcomes. Look at the preconditions for success that you've identified, and ensure that the links you're making between your activity, your output, your outcomes, make sure that you can justify these. You may also need to look at the contextual or environmental factors that will support or hinder progress towards achieving your desired change. For our summer school, some of the examples of some of our assumptions are that the summer school will go ahead, that students will apply to take part in the summer school, that attendance and engagement will be sustained, and of course that participating in a summer school does in fact lead to increased access and participation in higher education for the target group. So moving on to the next slide, we now have a completed theory of change for a summer school program, which sets out how we understand the different aspects of the program and how they fit together to achieve our final goal, with all of the sections filled in. Hopefully, when you have a complete theory of change, you'll have a clear and testable hypothesis about how the desired change will happen. This then enables you not only to be accountable for results, but also makes your results much more credible, because you can evidence how you predicted that results would happen in a certain way. You've got a visual representation of the change you want to bring about and how you expect it to come about. And you've also got an agreement among stakeholders about what defines success and what it takes to get you there. And this can also be used as a communication tool to capture the complexity of your initiative, your project. You can use your theory as a basis for reports to funders, policymakers, to boards. Obviously use it to monitor the progress, check milestones, to stay on track and to evaluate your project. If, for example, at the end of your project, your evaluation reveals no or even a negative impact, a well-designed theory of change will help the evaluator distinguish between theory fallacy, so the underlying assumptions that are not leading to the intended outcomes, implementation fallacy, the intervention was not implemented as intended, or methodology fallacy. So unsuitable evaluation methods were used, or suitable methods were used insufficiently. And for anyone that was at the previous session with Dr. Ben Stiles, he also stressed having a sound theory of change and how important that is, but in this case, randomized control trials in education. He also made the important point that actually it's very good to test your theory if possible, especially on a large scale trial. This can help save a lot of time and money if you're able to test it, and then you can see whether there are any kind of chinks or gaps in the links and the assumptions that you've made. Okay, back to Sarah.
Helen, we just got a question that's come in that I thought would be quite good to ask now, if that's okay. So we've got the question that, would you include value for money in the evaluation? So do you look at costs and cost effectiveness?
We do. It's not. Yes, we do cost benefit analysis, and that is certainly something that you can include in a theory of change. And again, you'd have to look at how it's contributing to your aims, and track it back. How does the cost benefit analysis and value for money contribute? And it may be something that perhaps is part of your inputs, because if you carry out a cost benefit analysis and you find that the return in fact is you're getting little return on the input and resources that you've invested. So I think with summer schools, I can't remember exactly, I don't know whether you can, Sarah, for summer schools, it's worked out, I think, on whether students that attended a summer school as a specific provider actually then progress to that specific provider. So in that case, of course, the time, money that's being invested in that student is considered to be positive.
Thank you, Helen. So I will get to the other questions at the end because I think they'll fit a bit more better at the end there. So we've got our theory of change. I appreciate that was very much a whistle-stop tour of a theory of change, but we just wanted to have a quick look now at indicators of success. So this is basically measuring your activity or your program. So as I've just said, setting indicators of success or sources of evidence will enable you to measure your program. So measure whether it's had the impact you want and whether it's been implemented in the way that you want it to. So it will help you ask the right questions. It will help you get the right evidence that show that you've achieved what you want, or whether you haven't, and therefore you might need to tweak your theory of change or amend your program. So we're going to look at two things. One is an outcome indicator. So these are things that you measure to show whether your desired outcomes have actually happened. And also output indicators. So these can show whether your planned outputs, your deliverables, have actually happened. So I've put there as well that they can be qualitative or quantitative. So I don't know if many in our audience were able to go to our conference yesterday as well, but there was a lot of chat all day about using mixed methods approaches. So you're looking at qualitative as well as quantitative, so both together. I think if you think about a randomized controlled trial, it sounds so heavily quant, but it's really important that you've got this sort of qualitative work in there as well to actually get to the bottom of why this sort of change is happening and what's actually happening there. So that will be clearer when I go through the example in the next slide. So let's say that our activity from our summer school is the subject taster sessions. So our direct output here that we discussed was that students are actually exposed to different subjects available at HE. So remember, an output has to be tangible. So we're not saying that they've learned about or increased their knowledge, because we don't know that for sure. But we can say for definite that they were exposed or they were given the opportunity to attend some subject taster sessions. So in terms of actually verifying whether this has happened or not and using indicators, we'd want to look at the number of sessions held. So we can look at our project records here, so we can actually see, did the sessions happen? And also, did students attend? So we can't say this output was achieved if we held the sessions, but no one actually attended them. So because that obviously wouldn't work. So we need to look at registers, we need to look at attendance as well. But something else you might want to look at is actually collecting student feedback. So did the session deliver actually what you wanted to do? So were students exposed to different subjects available at HE? So you can look at in-session feedback. So we've been exploring something called VVox. I'm not sure if you'll be familiar with that, but you can get really quick instant feedback in sessions using student, they'll just be on their phones, instant feedback to basically say what if they've learned something or what exactly they've been doing during that session. And you can also use focus groups, so actually getting groups of students together and going into a bit more detail there on whether you actually achieved that output. So do they feel that they were exposed and had the opportunity to sort of explore different subjects that were available in HE? You then look at when to collect. So again, this would be during each session. It could be after individual sessions, or it could be after the summer school altogether. So it does vary, and it's good to do sort of multiple sources there. And in terms of who will collect, it will be your summer school staff or your widening participation team. But I've also put in there a project research assistant. So I know this might not be the case for a lot of outreach activities that you're actually going to have a research assistant in. But I put this example in because Taso are actually doing this summer school evaluation currently, and part of the funding has allowed for our partner universities to hire research assistants to help with this sort of data collection, because it can be quite time consuming. You need the staff and you need the resources to support with that. So moving on to our outcome indicators. So following on from our last example, let's say our outcome is increased knowledge of subject options. So you hope from being exposed to different subjects that these students have now got increased knowledge of the subject options available to them. But how do we know if that's actually happened? So our indicators here, again, we'd want to use some qualitative methods. So we'd look at the actual feedback from students. So again, looking at focus groups, surveys, and really trying to find out whether students do feel that their knowledge has increased from attending those sessions. So has their knowledge increased of the subject options available to them? But something we're looking at as well in our summer schools randomized control trial, we're also looking at tracking data. So I'm hoping a lot of you will be aware of HEAT, or you might, which is the Higher Education Access Tracker. You're likely to use that or subscribe to that. You might also use the Aim Higher tracker, or you might not do tracking. But just to let you know that tracking data is available. It comes from HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and HEAT. If you subscribe to HEAT, they can provide that tracking data for you. So it means you can actually look if they are progressing on to one of the subjects that you addressed in your summer school, if your summer school is indeed subject focused. So again, you'd collect this during or post the event or post the session, but you'd also get that at HE enrollment. So it's worth pointing out here that if you're working with younger students, this might not actually happen till obviously several years, in which case survey data and getting that feedback from students is going to be more important here. But for, say, if you've got a year 12 summer school, they're looking to apply to higher education the following year. So it's good to get that tracking data in place there. And then again, in terms of who will collect, it will be the provider, the program staff, and you can use these tracking services like HEAT in order to get that data. And then one final example, quite similar, another outcome we had is that we want students to see HE as a more desirable option. So it's important for them to actually, for them to enroll in HE, they need to see HE as a desirable option to them. So in order to, our indicators here, again, we can use surveys, we can use interviews, you can do something like a pre and post survey. So you can see before attending the summer school, what was their interest in attending HE? And after attending the summer school, what was their interest in applying to HE? So you can see if there has been an increase there, and you can see exactly with focus groups and interviews, exactly what it was about the summer school which led them to increase or indeed not their interest in attending higher education. And then also, like we talked about in the last example, you'd use some quant data as well. So you'd use some administrative data to see, did the students that attend your summer school actually apply to HE? And again, you can use these tracking services such as HEAT or Aim Higher in order to get this information. So you'd again do this either after the summer school, during the summer school, or at the time when they're actually enrolling in HE. And again, it will be your sort of project staff or your tracking services which would provide this data for you. So that could almost provide a whole session just looking on these sort of indicators of success or sources of evidence. And obviously with our time, we weren't able to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but I hope just a couple of those examples makes it clear that you should use a mixed methods approach, and also just these different sources that you can actually find which are going to indicate whether your outcomes or your outputs have been achieved. So just a little recap of the session before we move on to questions. So just to show, so we went through the diagnose stage of the evaluation cycle. So this is very much the beginning of the cycle when you would start your theory of change. And there is later stages as well, which again would take more sort of webinars to go through, which will be available at a later stage. We talked about what a theory of change is, what a theory of change does, and also how to develop your own theory of change. So we used a specific example here is a summer school, but you could apply it to other programs. You can be a lot more specific, or you can be more general in your aim. So you can really adapt the theory of change for what you need. And then finally, we looked at setting indicators of success to measure if your outputs and your outcomes are actually happening. So I'll pass back to Helen now for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. We can now open up for questions, and don't forget, if you do have them, to put them in the Q&A box and not in the chat. We do have one. We have one here, which I'm going to pass to Sarah, but I think we can probably we can answer jointly, which is about the different if your program has a number of different streams or activities, such as attainment raising strategies, careers guidance, HEI, AG, etc. Can you fit those into one theory of change, or do you need to have a number of theories of change? Do you want to take that, Sarah?
Yeah, I can do. It's up to you. I'll take it, but you can add more to it if you'd like to. So this is an interesting question, and one we get quite a lot when we run these sort of sessions. So ideally, actually, it really depends on what your aim is. So if your aim or your impact or your overall outcomes for each of these individual things is the same, so if you have the same overall aim, the same impacts that you want from these sessions, then in theory, you can just put it into one theory of change, because they've got the same aim, they've got the same outcomes that you want to achieve. So similar to that summer school example we did, if you look at it, a summer school is kind of like a multi-intervention outreach program, because it's split by so many different activities. But if your different activities have different aims or different impacts, so maybe your careers guidance obviously is really specifically related to them finding employment or learning about different careers, you might want to do one individually for that, because you could fill a theory of change on its own just with that session. So it's kind of really thinking about what the aims are of your session, and what your overarching aim, and what your outcomes and impacts, what you want them to be, and if they match up, because you can't really put them on the same theory of change if they've got very different outcomes that you want to get from them. So I hope that helps. I don't know if you've got anything more to add to that, Helen.
At my project, so this is that we're actually running a project at the moment with three providers and they're each conducting a multi-intervention outreach and mentoring program. So what we're trying to do at the moment is to see whether it's possible to actually develop a framework and a theory of change that is generic and that providers can use in order to capture the different streams and the different outreach activities. I did just use the word generic there, but of course what we don't want is for the theory of change to be so high level and so generic that it doesn't actually capture what the outcomes and the impact that you're looking for. But yeah, watch this space. The MyOn project is currently underway. So I would just very much concur with what Sarah says, that it does depend. It depends on what you're trying to achieve through your project. Got another interesting one here about the difference between a logic model and a theory of change. That's another interesting question. As time has gone on, they do get used interchangeably. So people talk about logic models and theories of change, and sometimes mean the same thing. But historically, logic models, I think, started probably many years ago. I'm not entirely sure when, but I know that theories of change developed around the mid 90s by someone called Carol Weiss, and a logic model or a log frame. The reason why Carol was interested in looking at in developing a theory of change is because the causal assumptions weren't there. They're not there in the original meaning of a log frame. They were very poorly articulated. And there was a lack of clarity in the little steps, so the links that we've been talking about that need to be taken to reach a long-term outcome. When that meant that it was quite difficult to evaluate a project properly, made it much more challenging, because those long-term factors that were missing, that they needed to be addressed. So yeah, I mean, I think there's probably quite a lot of work, a lot of reading around that. But yes, historically they're different, but just to confuse matters, they are now used interchangeably. More questions. One here, if an evaluation hasn't been embedded into a program of activities from the beginning, is it possible to retrospectively create a theory of change for evaluation? If so, how? The answer is yes, you can do. Obviously, as we've said, it's much better to have that, to have it built in, all your evaluation activities built in from the start. But yes, you can develop one retrospectively. And I think you would go through the same processes, and you can, by going through that process, actually, so that the work and the activities that have already been conducted, by going through the process of developing the theory of change, you can start to think about actually these assumptions and that we were making about our activities that would lead to these outputs and outcomes. Actually, through unpicking and unpacking, we're actually finding that then they're not holding true, that we can't actually follow that pathway. So it's a really useful process to go through that backwards mapping, and then go through the see if you can follow your pathway of change through, even if it's partway through a program. This is one that I can't answer. Actually, I don't know whether you can, Sarah, about tracking data being available for colleges who deliver HE.
Yeah, I saw that question, and my understanding is, and I would gladly be corrected here if anyone wants to come in on this, it would be really helpful. But my understanding is that you would subscribe to a tracking service like HEAT. So if you do subscribe to it as an FE college, you would be able to obtain that tracking data. My experience with HEAT is actually from working at a university. So I will confess that I've got limited knowledge from a further education provider, but I do know that my colleagues in Taso, other than Helen and I, will know that. So I can certainly ask for you as well. But if anyone happens to know that for definite, then I would definitely welcome a comment. That would be really helpful.
Okay, we got a question here actually about where people can find out more information. So I don't know whether you want to move on to the next slide.
Yeah, I can do in a moment. I just saw one question actually, which I thought was a really good question. It was in the chat, but just because I just saw it pop up. It's also a very long question, so I'm not sure if I can get it out correctly in one go. But the question is, would you say that the assumptions about the mechanisms linking the outcomes and impact are often undervalued or under-theorized? So let's say I think the specific example they say is that it assumes that knowledge and perceptions about HE are students' biggest barrier. That's what our example theory of change was saying, but it actually might be some other barriers. They've said something like inadequate transport infrastructure. So just, yeah, basically just being careful not to assume things is what the question was there. Does that make sense, Helen?
Absolutely, yes, and it's obviously a very, very good point as well. But just to kind of reiterate that this was a whistle-stop tour of a theory of change. So for another, when developing your theory of change, you might actually go into much more detail. So you might be wanting to look at root causes, for example, and develop it much more deeply. But I also think that's a really good point, that sort of when we were talking about testing your theory of change as well. So if you can kind of try to pilot it, you know, is there a break in the link there? Is that a linkage or a connection that we're making that isn't actually a valid one? And the other thing is that as well, obviously this is to be used as part of your monitoring and evaluation. And as part of this, you would develop your implementation and process evaluation as well. So hopefully that will be things that you will be able to pick up through your evaluation work. So that again, you know, if it's these assumptions we've made about summer schools being a good thing, if we find out that actually either that there's a null result, or in fact that had a negative result, or that the participation has increased, and it's not actually anything to do with summer schools at all. It's something else entirely. But hopefully that's what would be picked up through your implementation and process evaluation, because you'd be getting that rich qualitative data to actually find out more about what young people, what students are thinking. I think we've got some more.
Yeah, so there's a question at the top actually, which is, what is Taso's plan essentially? Are we looking to eventually publish research and evaluation of interventions? Which is a good question. So Helen mentioned that we're doing a project on them at the moment on multi-intervention outreach programs, and also that we're doing a project on summer schools. So yeah, certainly we're looking to contribute to the evidence here. So I'm not sure if you caught Eliza, our Deputy Director, her keynote at the start. She did mention about an evidence, which has already, we've got an evidence toolkit essentially. So we've done a report on what has already been produced in these areas, so and what's lacking in terms of evidence. So that's why we've chosen these specific subjects and these specific projects to sort of add to that evidence. But it's certainly worth mentioning that obviously with the pandemic, summer schools are now online, so the evidence we can provide is definitely generalizable, but it is quite specific as well to online and virtual summer schools. So because of that, we're not doing the research project that we set out to, but obviously we will look to do that once the pandemic hopefully finishes.
Yeah, and we do have our toolkit, but that is all available on our website. But we're very new still. Yeah, it's the 1st of April that we were, as we said, incubated in Kings. So we've kind of we've been in the making as an organisation. We've been in the making for a while, but we are very new as a charity. So we are. A lot of our work is in development, but we do have a toolkit and we do have resources available currently on our website. A question here about using a deductive approach and how you incorporate user or community views, insights, ideas. That's good. That's as we're talking about the stakeholder input. If you possibly can, you develop your theory of change together with the group, the community, and the group of people that you're working with, because you're absolutely right. There's no point in just one group or one part of the project developing what they think is of this fabulous theory of change. If there are other groups who should be involved and should have a voice, because again, that's where your theory can fall down if you're not getting everyone's insights and viewpoints. And I think that was there's something with our My Own project, for example. There can be things like differences in how we talk about outreach, how we explain outreach, how we understand mentoring. So I think that's really important that you do talk to other people involved in the project, because you can be I say mentoring again, but that's one of the ones where again it's used a lot. But when you look at what's involved in the mentoring program, they're often very different. And what we understand by mentoring can be another provider might actually, when we're looking at it, what we would understand by coaching. So yes, it's really good to critical to involve stakeholders to make sure that your theory and your pathway of change actually does hold.
I think we've run out of time, I think, because it's 1 minute till 1. So apologies that we haven't able to get to all of your questions, but if you have got anything really specific you want to ask, then please do email us, and all the information is on our website. And moving to that.
Yes, so Taso's evaluation guidance is on our website for lots more advice, particularly on the evaluation cycle, and moving on from the diagnose stage that we've covered in this session. We also have a resources hub where you can download all sorts of helpful resources, including those needed for hosting your own theory of change workshop, which you will now be able to do, of course. And again, very useful when you're wanting to involve stakeholders in the wider community. And evidence toolkit is available on the website. And don't forget that this session was recorded, so you can come back to it with your theory of change template should you want to. And do look out for an email from us with a post-event survey to complete. And I'd just like to say thank you very, very much to everyone for attending. This was our first TASO conference, so I really, really hope that next year we'll be able to meet all of you in person. So thank you and stay safe and take care.